And the scripture for today is from, how many of you have ever read through the book of Proverbs? Have you? There's one person. It's not that long. Proverbs is a collection of teachings, if you'll have it. It's part of what in the Old Testament we refer to now as the wisdom literature. That would be Proverbs and Psalms and Ecclesiastes and the book of Job and things like that. That's the wisdom literature. Has all kinds of good ideas about life and things like that. But it tackles one of the most difficult and long-lasting problems of society today. So it's a big day, and at the end we get to share communion together. Let's begin our worship. Now, I told you it's from Proverbs. It's a great name. What's a proverb? Anybody want to tell me? A proverb is? Something to live by. A story with a lesson. It's usually a witty story with a lesson. But this one isn't. This one has a lesson. And it's going to deal with, as I said earlier, one of the most complex, and certainly it's lasted forever, problems the human society faces. And that is the division between those who are thought of as rich and those who are thought of as poor. This comes from Proverbs 22. It's a few verses here, a few verses. It starts with verses 1 and 2. A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver or gold. The rich and the poor have this in common: the Lord is the maker of them all. And then verses 8 and 9. Whoever shows justice will reap calamity, and living in anger will always fail. Those who are generous are blessed, for they share their bread with the poor. And then verses 22 and 23. Do not rob the poor because they are poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate. For the Lord pleads their cause, and does not give richness of life to those who ignore the poor. Here ends the reading of Scripture. May God grant its meaning to our hearts and minds. Now, today is our monthly intergenerational service. There are 2 kids here. Guess what? You don't have to come up today. But will you do something for me? Will you answer questions if I ask them while you're seated there? Maybe. Maybe. In the early part of the 20th century in the United States, the Industrial Revolution had reached such a point that there were more poor people than there had ever been before, even though there were great riches being developed. What had happened, a lot of economists, very conservative economists, by the way, have now decided was that capitalism had not been followed in the way that it was meant to be. Now, how many of you know something about, the ideas behind capitalism? Anybody know a little bit about it? Everybody that I talk to seems to think that the point of capitalism is to produce wealth. How many of you have heard that? Okay. That's not true. Capitalism produces wealth which is supposed to produce prosperity for all. I'm just quoting from the inventors of capitalism. Prosperity for all. And in fact, capitalism, they warned very early on when they started talking about what it might look like, that if all it did was produce wealth in a few, it would collapse in on itself. Well, in the early 20th century, that's where this nation had gotten. There were poor people everywhere, and they were working their lives to death in the steel mills and places like that and getting paid hardly anything. Well, it didn't take long for the Great Depression to set in. And after the Depression, a president and finally a few people in the Congress, who were accused of being communists, by the way, decided that one of the ways out of this terrible situation was that the government, through the power of taxation and the power of granting money to certain efforts, could do a better distribution of wealth so that everybody could have prosperity. And you know what happened? It really worked for a while. And then World War II came along. And we went to a wartime economy. Great amount of debt and everything was built up. But what happened after World War II in the United States and in parts of Europe eventually was that for the first time in the history of the world, a nation was able to keep a booming wartime economy going after the war was over. Capitalism went crazy. But back then, in the late 1940s and the early all the way through the 1950s, most of us were alive then. Some of us weren't, but for those of us who were alive then and paying enough attention, the taxation system of the United States was such that it was called a progressive taxation system. And so if you weren't making very much, you didn't pay very much. Made a little bit more, you paid a little bit more. Made more, you paid somewhat more. Made a lot, you paid a lot more. Because what they figured was, if you have a lot of money, you aren't going to miss, like if you're making $1 million a year and you got to give away 20,000 of it, guess what? You still have $980,000 to live on. So nobody, and things really went well. It was the first nation that ever had a sustainable middle class and everything. And it didn't take very long until they invented something called trickle-down economics. Ever hear of those? There's one thing about that theory that is provable. You know what it is? You look at it historically, it has never happened. It doesn't work. But that's what happened. And we went back to the early 20th century. And then for some reason, during the days that William Clinton was president, the economists will tell you, because the tax structure was again more progressive than it had been for a while, the economy did its best that it had ever done. It was the first balanced budget the United States had almost since the end of World War II. And there was prosperity almost for everyone. Well, let's see, it's the early 21st century, and you know what the truth is right now? Income disparity is worse now than it was at the beginning of the 20th century. It's worse now than it was at the end of the 19th century. There should be an alarm going off. But I'm only bringing that up because who suffers the most economically at a time like this? No. Who suffers the most? The poor. When don't they suffer the most economically? When the government has distributed things more equally. Doesn't mean they get rich, it just means they don't suffer as much, okay? So the poor is a concern. But is it a concern for society as a whole right now? Is it? Objectively it is, but is it the society seem to be very concerned? Not if you see the laws that are passed or the laws that aren't passed. Not if you see what's happening. And now the middle class is becoming poorer too. You know what happened in other countries like this historically when things like this happened? Yeah, almost every time. Revolutions, what happened to Rome and everything like that. So, There is an issue with the poor. What's the answer? Good luck. It's a tough question, isn't it? It's a tough question. Should we just give more money away? Probably not. That's been tried and it didn't work very well. Jobs, that worked pretty well after before World War II, after the Great Depression. But there's no easy answer. Do you remember that there's a story in the New Testament where Jesus says that it was okay for the woman to pour all that expensive oil on his hair and on his feet? I think it was Judas, actually, who complained that that's terrible to waste things like that. They could sell the oil and give the money to the poor. You remember that story? Remember what Jesus said? You'll always have the poor with you, but not always have me. Well, I like to tease my congregation, so I'll tease you too. That we ought to hear that you'll always have the poor with you as a commandment. A commandment. You shall always have the poor with you. What would that take for us to make that true? It would take an effort on our part to include ourselves among the poor, because they've been marginalized. You don't see the poor anymore. They live in their own places, don't they? And they know who they are and how people think of them, so they stay out of the way. You shall always have the poor among you. Well, according to Proverbs, God tilts toward the poor. Is that fair to say from what Proverbs said? Think of the teachings of Jesus. If you did this unto one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it to me. If you didn't do it to them, guess what? You didn't do it to me. God tilts toward the poor, we're told. Now, what's that mean for you and for me? You shall always have the poor with you. If we treated that as a commandment, we would always be tilting toward the poor. Now, if this had been a children's message, I wouldn't have been going through all that history and stuff. But I would have asked them what it means to be poor, and they would have probably told me, you don't have any money. Don't you think that's what they would have said? I think that's what most of us think of when we think of the poor, don't we? Do you think of any other ways of being poor? What? Not having any hope. Wow. That's the worst kind, isn't it? Ooh. Any other ways of being poor?
No family.
Yeah, that's great. No family, how about being alone all the time? What are you poor from then? What don't you have? Fellowship. You don't have any intimacy with anybody. There's nobody to talk to. What's some other ways of being poor? Homeless, wow. Yeah. Other ways of being poor.
I don't know how to say it, but a good relationship with Jesus. If you know, myself, if you know about Jesus, then to me you can be poor if you don't have, like my mom and I have always talked, how do these people survive that don't have Jesus or God?
Well, a lot of them have a lot of money, that's how. No, seriously, that's a good point. But that's a kind of survival that maybe isn't just eking things out. The Old Testament understanding of community, I mean, this is the ancient Hebrew understanding, it was a community filled with justice. And what that kind of justice is, that no one has to go without what they need. No one in our community has to go without what they need. So if you don't have enough, you're poor. Is that okay? Let's just use that definition as our religious definition of being poor. When you don't have enough of something to live well. It is a fact that human babies, when they're born, they need somebody to touch them. and to hold them. Even if they're deaf, you still need to hold them. They can't hear you, but they can feel they're being held. If they don't have that, they will become ill. They can even die. How many of you knew that? That's a fact. Yeah, it's a fact. So somebody that's already grown up and everything, but doesn't have any contact, that's all alone, oh, that's a real kind of poverty. And we need to be concerned about that person. How about a person who's fallen in love with money? What don't they have? Probably. They don't have empathy, they don't have compassion, they don't have very many relationships, if any, with other people that are loving, caring, supportive, anything like that. How do we deal? Okay, we're Christians. We have to be concerned about the poor. Let's talk about those who are economically poor for a second. What is the solution to the problem of economic poverty? What do we believe is the solution? Justice. Justice. That's the problem. That's the solution to the societal problem of economic poorness. Justice. And we believe it's the Old Testament understanding of justice. Now, you get a real quick ethics lesson here. There's all different kinds of justice. One's retributive justice. Anybody know what the example of retributive justice is? Well, it's a death penalty. But in the Bible, it's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You know, you do something wrong, you get punished for it in a justifiable manner. That's retributive justice. There's the kind of equitable justice. You see the blind lady justice with the scales and everything like that. You're trying to weigh things and be fair. So fairness is a kind of justice. But the Old Testament, and therefore the Judeo-Christian understanding of justice, is called distributive justice. Distributive justice makes sure that everyone has enough to live well. Not to be rich, but to live well, so you don't have to wonder where the next meal's coming from. You don't have to wear 3 pairs of clothes because that covers all the holes in the other pairs and stuff like that. You aren't going to be homeless. You aren't going to be without hope. You aren't going to be without friends or family. All those things. That's distributive justice. That means everybody cares about everybody. And the old teaching of the Hebrews was, if one member of our community suffers, all of us suffer the same way. That gave people a reason to want to do something for them. So we are supposed to care about the poor. How about if we care for the poor? How about if we even start thinking one of the ways we're going to find God in our lives is to be bold and loving enough to go and have the poor so they become a part of our lives and we become a part of their lives, maybe even our church life, so that they shall always be among us, but we find the answers, and at least for them, they have enough. If we can find ways to do that, feeding ministry, tutoring ministry, visitation ministries, who knows? If we do that, we just might have a lot to talk about the God that we met in doing it. Those with ears to hear, let them hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.